Hello, everyone. As announced, my name is Summer Panage, and I am so excited to be here. It's my first time in Singapore, and it's a wonderful place. I've had that intro before, mentioning that I quit my job and run away to the circus, and oftentimes people think that's a joke, and I decided I should probably have proof because no one ever believes that. So this is, in fact, the circus I ran away with, and that is me in the middle, upside down. So. It's not a joke, it really happened. It was good times. Anyway, enough about that. Let's go back to navigation. So normally I speak on the topic of accessibility, and in fact I recognize a lot of you from conferences where I've spoken on that topic. But I decided to change it up a bit this time and talk about something a bit different because we have an awesome person speaking later today on accessibility. So I was like, well, this is my chance to do something new. And so today I'm going to talk about something that I know that we all have thought about, and we see blog posts called slimming down your view controller, lightweight view controllers. We see all this information about how we need to make our view controllers smaller and move things out of them. And one of the things we often have to move out of our view controllers is navigation. And so this talk is going to be how at my startup we figured out kind of bumbled our way towards moving navigation out of our view controllers and what that pattern that we worked together to figure out looks like. So here is something that we all know and love. This is a very standard navigation flow. We have ViewControllerA, and maybe it's a table. And we click, we tap, and we go to ViewControllerB. And maybe it has a button somewhere in the nav bar. And we tap the button, and we're off to ViewControllerC. It's a very standard flow that we all know and love, and we've probably all written a million times. ViewControllerA probably has some code that looks like this. And code's a bit blurry, but I will have these slides up online if anyone's having trouble. Anyway, ViewControllerA probably has some code like this. It's a pretty standard table view. We get the data from our data model, and we create a new view controller. We create a detail view controller, ViewControllerB. And we set the data on our view controller, and then we say, hey, navigation controller, why don't you push that new view controller onto your stack, and while you're at it, go ahead and animate that. And off it goes. And now we're in ViewControllerB. And ViewControllerB, maybe it has some code like this. Maybe we go up to the navigation item. We want a little button in that nav bar to go to ViewControllerC. So we configure that. And then when we tap it, that's going to do the same thing. It's going to make our next view controller for us, and it's going to pass it back to our navigation controller. And this is really common. This is pretty standard code. And so the question you might be asking is, what's wrong with that? So some of the struggles that happen when we write code like this happen as our app grows. But even at the smallest scale, there's some kind of philosophical issues here. So first of all, ViewControllerA is creating another view controller that is not its child. Actually, this new view controller, ViewControllerB, is going to be the child of our navigation controller. That's who's going to take ownership of it and manage it. So this is kind of like if you have a child, and then you give it to your parent, and you're like, nah, this is yours. That's kind of what you're doing. So it doesn't quite make sense that we're making the view controller, but then we're sending it back to the navigation controller. And also, along that same vein, we are in fact assuming there's a navigation controller at all. If I'm a table view and a table view controller, there's no rule that I have to have a navigation controller. I'm just making that assumption inside ViewControllerA. Maybe I'm just presented plain. Maybe I'm in a tab controller. Who knows? And also, ViewControllerA is not just assuming the navigation, it's deciding how to transition. It's deciding on that push animation, or maybe it's creating a custom animation. But ViewControllerA is making the decision about how to get to the next place. So ViewControllerA has a lot of jobs. It's a parent, it's acting like a child, and it's also a boss. It's doing all these different things. And a little subtle detail in there, in that in all those assumptions, is it's also the implicit navigation controller, which we just talked about. So you can imagine in the scenario where I configure a bar button item inside my view controller, but then maybe I reconfigure the app, I rewrite my code, and I'm no longer inside a navigation controller. And all of a sudden, I'm assuming that button is there, but in fact, I have no access to a navigation controller anymore. So that button's not there anymore either. So there's just like kind of an implicit sense of a navigation controller where I can configure things that may not exist at all. Here's another pattern that is equally common. We have ViewControllerA, and now maybe it's still a table view, but it has 3 different kinds of cells. And if I tap one type, I go to B, another type D, another type E, and so forth. So now ViewControllerA is probably going to have some big blob of code that looks like this. And really, it's just the same thing we had before, but now we see it 3 times. 3 times we're getting our data, we're setting it on the correct view controller based on the type of the data, and then we're going ahead and sending it back to that navigation controller and pushing it on the stack. So what's kind of weird here is that ViewControllerA, it didn't actually change. It's still displaying essentially the same kind of data, but all of a sudden it's kind of bloated out because of where it can go. So what happened is that we have more navigation in our app, and that actually bloated out the view controller before that navigation even happens. So it's kind of a weird place to have to bloat your code just for navigation. So as our app is gaining complexity, each view controller can become bigger because it has to handle more and more options. And now imagine if each of these transitions were custom and had all kinds of fancy animations, and if we put all of that inside ViewControllerA, it would, pretty soon we're on our way to the 4,000 line view controller, and that's something none of us want. So let's quickly summarize. What are the problems? Well, view controllers are not independent. By instantiating A, I'm implicitly getting whatever view controllers it instantiates and whatever view controllers those instantiate. So there's this implicit dependency. When I pick one view controller, I kind of get the whole tree. Also, view controllers are depending on a parent that may or may not exist. In the case we saw, they're depending on a navigation controller. And what if there isn't one? What if we're modal? This can cause bugs that we have to go track down, code we have to go fiddle with later. And of course, as app complexity goes up, view controllers start to bloat with that navigation logic and with the how logic, with the animation logic, etc. So in my small startup, we wanted to head this off. Right at the bat, we were like, nope, we don't want to have these big bloated view controllers. But we also didn't want to commit to some of the more heavy-handed solutions. So there are ways you can use dependency injection frameworks. There are ways that you can use reactive frameworks to help you avoid bloated view controllers. But we weren't really ready to commit to those because we knew we'd be hiring a lot of people, and we knew that the time to kind of learn and ramp up on those frameworks can be a little slow, especially for some junior developers. So we wanted to stick with patterns that already were around. And so we thought, well, we'll start really simple, and then we'll try to evolve. So what we started with was something that we all know, which is delegation. We thought, well, whenever you want something to be taken care of somewhere else, you delegate it away. So that's where we started. So we started with this mess, right? This is where everything is instantiating everything else, and you have this net of things. That's kind of where we started, and we're like, okay, we want to get away from that. We want to make sure that our app doesn't have that kind of net-like structure. And so we're going to go ahead and try to delegate away and create a cleaner flow. And the flow we wanted to have is something a little more like this, where we have something linear, and then we have a delegate that essentially is in charge of all the navigation for us. And the only thing each view controller has to know about is that it has this delegate, and it can talk to it, and the delegate will take care of everything else. Now, before I go on, I want to point out this is not the final solution. So if you leave the talk right now, don't go and make delegates for everything right away. This is kind of our partial solution to help you see how we got there and the gains that are won just with this delegation. So the next question is probably, well, how does this work? So I can't actually show the app that we're working on at my job because it's a startup and there's NDAs and all those fun things. So I wrote a little sample app that we can go through and see how this pattern works, and the next pattern as well, with this sample app. So in the sample app, it's using Star Wars. I love the Swappy API. And it's very simple. It's a table view. You can tap into a Star Wars film. You can tap into a character. From the character, you can see what films that character was in. You can also, if you check out another character, you can see what starships that character flew. Check that out. Yeah. So just super simple little Star Wars app for your favorite fan trivia. And then we're going to use this now to dig in and understand a little more about how this all works. So each view controller needs to delegate navigation somewhere else. So each view controller requires a navigation delegate. And now we're going to have some root view controller somewhere up in way far away from our regular view controllers. And for now, we're going to call that master navigation view controller. And that's just going to be the delegate of all my other view controllers, and it's going to wire up the navigation. So how would this change? Well, in the app we just saw, we clearly had a movie list, we had a movie view controller, we had a character view controller, we had a starship. So we had these simple view controllers. So in that app, each view controller would have a delegate. So the movie list view controller would have a delegate that has to implement did select film. And then the movie list view controller itself, it would look pretty much the same, except in the table view did select row at index path method, it would just tell the delegate, hey, we did select this film with this ID, you go deal with it. And of course, the delegate would go off and deal with it. Very similarly, there's the movie detail view controller. Here, we can tap a character. And once again, here's a character view controller. Here, we can tap a movie or a starship. So we just have a delegate for every single view controller. That delegate says, where can we go? How do we get there? And we pass it back. Now, way up at the top, I have my master navigation view controller, and its job is simply to implement these delegates. So we can see we extend our master navigation, and we go ahead and implement did select film for our movie list view controller. And it does what we saw before. It creates a detail view controller, and it pushes it on. But now, because I am the navigation controller, it's not so weird that I'm creating another view controller, because that view controller is my child. It makes sense that I'm putting my own child on my navigation stack. And similarly, it's going to implement all of the other delegate methods. So already, just using delegation, we've fixed a lot of the problems we saw originally. What did we fix? Well, individual view controllers are not controlling flow and presentation anymore. The movie view controller isn't controlling anything about where it goes next. Neither are the movie details, neither are the characters. Nothing's controlling anything outside of its own view controller. And the view controllers don't need to know about their parents. They just know there's some object, some delegate, and it can say, here's what I selected, and the delegate will take care of the rest. Maybe it'll show an alert. Maybe it will show a new view controller, but it'll do whatever it needs to do. And lastly, individual view controllers are no longer creating other view controllers that aren't their own children. The only time we see view controller creation is up in our master, and our master is in fact the parent of the view controllers it creates. But we didn't fix everything. This delegation is nice, it helps us, but it doesn't fix everything. It has some issues. So first of all, we are still doing everything in a view controller. Now, sure, we're doing it in just one, but it's still in a view controller somewhere. Also, we're going to see in the next examples it can cause some weird implicit dependencies or code duplication. And finally, there tends to be lots of boilerplate with this pattern. So what do I mean? Well, first of all, this one's pretty obvious, right? Master navigation view controller, we can call it whatever we want, it's still a view controller. As the app grows, of course this is my top level view controller, it's going to have a lot of logic. And it's going to get bigger with its own logic, plus now it's in charge of all the navigation. So this can get pretty big and pretty nasty. And also we're still tied to the view controller lifetime. We're still tied to view did load, unload, etc. So the behavior of this controller could vary depending on where we are in our view controller life cycle. And it would be nice if navigation just had nothing to do with that, right? If we could just control navigation separately, as if it were just kind of a black box and we were just, pushing things into it. And finally, the individual view controller delegates can also get bloated because they're just delegates. We tend to put almost anything we don't want to do in our view controller into some delegate. And before you know it, these delegates aren't just doing navigation, they're doing all kinds of things. And that's not really good compartmentalizing either. So if we go back and look at our app, we remember how the character view controller shows a list of movies that the character was in. Now, if you tap on a movie, it takes you to the movie detail view controller again. So we have two pathways to see movie details. We can get there from the first screen, or we can get there from the character screen. So let's use this example to see one of the issues with the delegation pattern. So One of the issues is a little bit of code duplication. The movie list view controller has to have a did select film because you can select a film from there. Similarly, the character view controller has to have that too. And maybe that's written by another developer, and that developer called it did select movie. So now we have two delegate methods that go up to our delegate, and they do the same thing. And so then we look at the code in our master navigator, and sure enough, we see there are two implementations of these methods, and they do exactly the same thing. So maybe we're feeling crafty, and we're like, well, we'll just have one of them take care of it. We'll just get rid of the code from one, we'll change the name, so now both are called did select film, and now we can just rely on the implementation of one to handle the other. But that's not a good idea, because what if we change the app and we say, okay, now when you tap on a movie name, it's going to show you something different. It's going to show that opening crawl that happens on the screen at the beginning of every Star Wars film. So we make that change. You can see just one line right there. That change happens. But now any view controller that relied on this code is also going to go to that new place. So we can't really rely on the implementations from other delegates, because if we change one, then they're going to change everywhere. So we need to be smart about that. Also, there's just a lot of boilerplate. If every view controller has to have its own delegate, but if 4 things can go to the same place, then we're going to have basically the same methods everywhere. We're going to have the same declarations, delegate declarations everywhere. If I can get to the movie details from 4 places, then in 4 places I have to have did select movie or did select film. And potentially, as we saw, I might have to have 4 implementations of it to avoid issues where I'm depending on code that I shouldn't be. So there's just some funky little issues with this delegation pattern that we don't quite like. So we move on to the solution V2. This is what we called the Navigator. And I'm not going to pretend this is some the Navigator pattern. This is just what we called it. I'm sure there's probably other things out there called Navigator pattern as well. But this is what we just happened to name it. It's a Navigator. So what's so great about a Navigator? Well, a Navigator is not a view controller. A Navigator is a standalone object. It's not tied to the view controller lifecycle. It has nothing to do with view did load, unrelated. And we use Navigator protocols to not have to repeat all the boilerplate we saw in the delegation examples. So what's special about the Navigator protocols is we're going to start grouping our functionality. So we have a base protocol, that's our Navigator protocol, and all other navigators are going to inherit from that. Navigator protocols, as I mentioned, are grouped by functionality, not by view controller. So here we see the basics. We have a base Navigator protocol. Anything that I want all my view controllers to be able to do, any navigation I want them all to have, that can live in that base protocol. But anything specific, that's going to be broken out into functional navigators. So here we see I have a movie navigator. That's simply in charge of navigating me to a movie given a movie's ID. I have a character navigator, that's in charge of navigating me to characters. And I have a starship navigator, and that's in charge of getting me to starships. Now these have nothing to do with what view controllers they come from. They don't care. In fact, they don't care so much that I have to pass that information in case I do need to care at the very top level. So these are just strictly based on the functionality. They're based on where I'm going, not where I came from. Now, each view controller declares which functionality it needs by simply selecting navigators. So as you can see here, we've got the movie list, and the movie list only needs to go to one place. So it simply says, well, my navigator is just a movie navigator. It's the same thing. We can go ahead and type alias it, but we don't even need to. But now if we look at the character navigator, or the character view controller, it actually needs to be able to go to 2 places. It needs to be able to go to movies, and it needs to be able to go to starships. And so we can say, well, my navigator in this case is both the movie and the starship navigator. Now the great thing is, if I want to add functionality to my character view controller, so if I want to go beyond just movies and starships, maybe I want to also be able to show some error messaging, navigate to some error screen, all I have to do is say, well, my navigator now has to be one more type of navigator. In this case, we add the error navigator. So you can see the code didn't really change. I didn't have to go up to my delegate, add another line, nothing like that. I just simply said, oh, well, now my navigator also conforms to error navigator. So you'll notice no matter how many view controllers need the movie navigator or the error navigator, I only need to declare the protocol one time. Now at the top level, I'm going to have the app navigator. The app navigator is going to implement all my Navigator protocols in extensions. And the app delegate is going to create and run my app navigator for me. The app navigator will configure the root view controller and of course maintain a reference to it. And then it only has one job. It does exactly one thing. It manages app-wide navigation. It does nothing else. It's not a view controller, it's just a class. So the app navigator, as I said, it just takes control of navigation. Here we can see I initialize it. I give it my root view controller. In this case, that's going to be a navigation controller. And then I have run, and all run's going to do is going to put that first thing on the screen, whatever that may be. And perhaps it'll have some logic. Maybe it'll check if I'm logged in or logged out, if I'm a new user or not. But I like this because I can separate the creation and the setup of my navigator from the actual transitions it might cause. So already I'm liking this navigator better. Then the navigator goes on simply to implement my protocols. Here you can see these are just the implementations of my 3 protocols of my movie navigator, my character, and my spaceship. All these do are push the appropriate view controller onto the navigation stack of the navigation controller that I have a reference to. And if I ever need to, if for some reason I want to have a different behavior, I can use that view controller parameter to differentiate how I might behave given where I'm coming from. So let's say that I want to add a contextual more button when you navigate to the movie view controller from a character. Maybe I want a more button so I can see an image of that character from the movie. So we can customize the flow here. And obviously you would want to decompose this out. I just left it in line for simplicity. But we can customize that flow. We can say, oh, well, if I'm coming from this view controller, we're going to configure the nav bar a certain way. If not, no worries, we just push like normal. So did we solve our problems? Well, by defining our Navigator protocols by functionality, rather than per view controller, we avoided lots of boilerplate and code duplication. Also, we are no longer coupled to the view controller lifecycle, so that's great. So we kind of fixed those 2 issues we were having by delegating up to a master view controller. So how does this benefit you? Why does this really matter? Well, let's say my company decides we want an Apple TV or an iPad app. Now I've got these great standalone view controllers that I can use. They don't assume anything about their parents. They don't create children. So I can go ahead and just write a new app navigator or perhaps modify my app navigator to now work for a different device. Similarly, we all know that companies decide to do a big rewrite every now and then. And once again, because I have all my view controllers as standalone objects, doing a big rewrite becomes much simpler. And finally, in a small startup, we're moving fast, right? We're changing everything. But I don't actually want to break things. And so keeping the code of the navigator separate from the view controller makes it a lot less likely that when I go to make a navigation change, I'm going to break anything. So that feels really great. Now, this is great, right? But you might be thinking, okay, but my apps are more complex than this. Like the Star Wars app is cute, but they're more complex. And that's totally fine. Eventually, the app navigator might get too big. It might have too many layers of navigation. It might get too confusing there. So one thing we realized is that sometimes you might need a subnavigator. So let's say, for example, you have 2 different large push flows moving through your app. And each layer of this navigation can now be managed by its own navigator, and the app navigator will simply connect it all. So what does this look like in the simplest sense? Well, we can imagine that I'm adding a bar button item just like I was before, and it's going to be a more button, and that more button is actually going to lead us into some beautiful image navigation where we can navigate through images and quotes from the film, and it's going to be lovely. But that's its own flow, and that needs to be managed. So what happens if I want to present this in a modal in its own navigation flow? What we can do is we can simply have a subnavigator. And all a Subnavigator does is it's just a navigator, it does all the same stuff. The only difference is it's going to have essentially a dismiss block. And that dismiss block will take us back to our main navigator. So you can see here, I create once I tap that button, I create my new view controller, and I go ahead and create the navigator for it. I add that navigator to my navigation stack, so to speak, and then I run it. I go ahead and push my view controller, and that's it. The only special thing here you'll see is that my crawl navigator has a completion block. And in that completion block, I do two things. I dismiss whatever it is that I presented, that flow, and I also go ahead and remove that navigator from my navigator stack. So if you've seen a lot of talks on navigation before and on how to thin out your view controllers, you may think that, or you may recognize this as very similar to the coordinator pattern. And in fact, I hadn't seen the coordinator pattern when we went through all of this figuring stuff out at my startup. And then I was running through this talk with a friend of mine, and he was saying, oh, this reminds me a lot of the coordinator pattern. And in fact, it is very similar. So if you're already a fan of that pattern, this is very much along the same lines. There were two key differences. One key difference that I noticed when I was looking through both was that the coordinator tends to handle both navigation and model mutation. The navigator pattern here that we use handles only navigation. We have a completely separate object that deals with anything with the model. I personally like that. I like keeping that utterly separate, but again, I think the coordinator pattern is great. Another key difference between the two is that the coordinator pattern is still based at a view controller level. So each view controller declares what it needs, much like a delegate, and then that is handled by the coordinator. Whereas as we saw with the navigator pattern, this is based much more on grouping by functionality. So these are just the two key differences, but otherwise these are very similar patterns and both fantastic ways to get stuff out of your view controllers and into a separate standalone object. So let's go ahead and run through everything with a quick summary. What did we learn here? Well, view controllers should be reusable, they should be reorderable, that should all be very easy to do. And in order to do that, we need to avoid assumptions about where they live in the app. So a way to do that, one way, is a navigator. Navigators capture the flow of each of these individual entities, each of these individual view controllers. And navigators allow us to separate the what, the view controllers, etc., from the how. How does this get presented? How do I get there? So that's everything. Thank you all very, very much. And there's credit.
Thank you, Summer. So do we have any questions for Summer? There's a mic up there. Do you mind introducing yourself to Summer before you ask your question? Okay.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, so I want to ask about model mutations. Yeah, so you mentioned that using Navigator makes your controller reusable. Okay. Okay, so in the conclusion page, you said that the view controller should be reusable, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I personally explored about coordinators. So you said that Navigators doesn't handle model mutation.
Correct.
Okay, so view controllers may have dependencies, like concrete models, right? Like you said, maybe a movie object or a character object. If you want the view controllers to be reusable, where do you handle model mutations?
So we use, the way we've done it is we have a separate object. What did we name it? Not interactor, I've been reading too many blog posts. Essentially we have a separate object, model context object. And the model context object is something that any view controller that needs to do mutation also gets past one of those. And so if that view controller needs to do any mutations, it's going to it essentially will send them through that object, and that's also handled outside of the view controller. And so essentially each view controller may get a navigator and or a model context object.
Okay, so So where does the mutation object, who passes the mutation object to the view controller?
That all comes down, we have another, at the very top we have essentially, I think we just named it app, and app is the thing that branches off the app delegate, and it's going to instantiate my navigator, it's going to set up my model, everything like that, and it's going to send those, it's going to give the navigator references to whatever it needs to be able to pass to its view controllers.
Okay, so you're saying that like you have this one object that handles like model A to model B, model C to model B. Oh, so you put all the mutations in one object.
Yeah, so I mean, it's in extensions. We have it broken out into different files, but essentially it's coming down through one object. And we also use protocols to break up the functionality. So it's a very similar pattern, but just for mutation versus navigation.
Okay, so can I have one more question? So what do you think about deep linking?
Say that again?
Deep link. Oh, sorry. Deep link.
What about deep linking?
Yeah. So you said that similar to coordinators, you might have child navigators, right? Subnavigators.
Yep.
So what if like we have a deep link URL that may like move maybe 3 or 4 screens down?
Oh yeah. Oh gosh, we hit that issue. What did we do? It's a really, I can look at our code and see how we handled that, but I don't remember off the top of my head what we did. It's not the prettiest solution. I feel like deep linking is never the prettiest solution, but we did manage to handle it in the app navigator somehow. So if you come find me during lunch, I should have the answer for you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, David, for your question. Unfortunately, you only have time for one question today, so you can look for Summer at the break to ask her more.